The sound of rain against the windows of the Golden Lily restaurant created a steady rhythm that Marcus Holloway barely noticed anymore. At 62, he had mastered the art of existing in spaces without truly inhabiting them. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades turning conversations into contracts and relationships into revenue streams. Tonight was different, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the amber light from the chandeliers caught the droplets on the glass, or maybe it was the subtle ache in his chest that had been growing stronger with each passing year. The Golden Lily was his usual refuge on nights when the penthouse felt too quiet, when the weight of his empire pressed down like a suffocating blanket. He sat alone at table 17, the same corner booth he had occupied every Tuesday for the past 3 years. The leather was worn smooth from his presence, and the staff knew better than to seat anyone else there. They understood that Marcus Holloway valued consistency above all else, that his rituals were not to be disturbed. The menu lay unopened before him. He always ordered the same thing: grilled salmon, steamed vegetables, no sauce. It was practical, efficient, devoid of surprise or pleasure, just like everything else in his carefully constructed life. A young woman approached his table, her movements graceful despite the obvious exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes the colour of storm clouds. Her uniform was pressed and professional, but there was something in her posture that spoke of long hours and deeper struggles. "Good evening, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine despite the late hour. "I'm Sarah. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Marcus looked up from his phone, where he had been reviewing quarterly projections, and found himself caught off guard. There was something about her voice, a particular cadence that sent an unexpected jolt through his system. He studied her face more carefully, noting the curve of her jaw, the way she held her head slightly tilted when she spoke. "The usual, sir?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her notepad. But Marcus wasn't listening to her words anymore. He was lost in a memory that had surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful as broken glass. 27 years ago, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and broken dreams, he had held his newborn daughter for exactly 17 minutes before his wife's family had torn his world apart. The custody battle had been vicious and public, played out in tabloids that painted him as a cold corporate shark who cared more about his stock options than his child. His ex-wife's father, a federal judge with connections that ran deeper than oil wells, had orchestrated every move with surgical precision. By the time the legal dust settled, Marcus had lost everything that mattered: his daughter, his marriage, and any hope of redemption. Sarah shifted uncomfortably under his intense stare. "Sir, would you like me to give you a few more minutes?" The question pulled him back to the present, but the resemblance was undeniable now that he was really looking. The shape of her eyes, the way her mouth curved when she spoke, even the small scar above her left eyebrow that he remembered from those precious few months when he had been allowed supervised visits. "What's your last name?" The words escaped before he could stop them, rough and urgent. Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback by the personal question. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think that's really relevant to your dining experience." "Please." The desperation in his voice was naked, embarrassing. Marcus Holloway, who had never begged for anything in his life, was pleading with a waitress in a restaurant. "Just tell me your last name." Something in his tone must have reached her because her defensive posture softened slightly. "It's Chen," she said quietly. "Sarah Chen." The name hit him like a physical blow. Chen. His ex-wife had remarried a man named David Chen when their daughter was 3 years old. The adoption papers had been filed within 6 months, legally erasing Marcus from his own child's life. Emma Holloway had become Emma Chen, and all his attempts to maintain contact had been met with restraining orders and threats of further legal action. "Emma," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. Sarah's notepad slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Her face had gone pale, and she gripped the edge of the table as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. "What did you just call me?" The restaurant continued its quiet hum around them, but for Marcus, everything else had faded to white noise. Here she was, the daughter he had lost, the child he had searched for in every crowd, every photograph, every sleepless night for over 2 decades. She was alive, she was beautiful, and she was standing 3 feet away from him, wearing a name that wasn't his, but carrying features that unmistakably were. "Your birth name," Marcus said, his voice steadier now, but filled with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Before the adoption, it was Emma Holloway." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where a small pendant caught the light. It was a simple silver locket, nothing expensive or remarkable, but Marcus recognized it immediately. He had bought it for his wife during her pregnancy, inscribed with the words "For our little star" on the back. It had been the one thing he had managed to give his daughter before everything fell apart. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Her fingers worried at the locket, a nervous habit that Marcus remembered from when she was a toddler, always fidgeting with whatever small treasure she carried. "The locket," Marcus continued, his heart hammering against his ribs. "There's an inscription on the back. For our little star. I bought it 28 years ago, 2 months before you were born." The colour drained completely from Sarah's face. She took a step backward, then another, as if distance could somehow negate the impossible truth hanging between them. "You're mistaken. You have to be mistaken." But even as she said the words, Marcus could see the recognition dawning in her eyes. The pieces of her fractured childhood were falling into place, the gaps in her memory suddenly illuminated by this chance encounter. He could almost see her mind racing, connecting dots she had never been allowed to connect before. The Golden Lily had become a theatre for the most important scene of Marcus's life, and he was terrified of saying the wrong line, of somehow losing her again just when he had found her. 27 years of regret and longing crystallized into this single moment, this fragile bridge between past and present. "Your mother told you I was dead, didn't she?" Marcus asked gently, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "That's what the adoption papers said. Father deceased." Sarah's breath came in short gasps, and Marcus realized she was on the verge of panic. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to crescendo around them, creating a bubble of intimacy in the midst of chaos. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer comfort, but he knew that any sudden movement might send her running. "I need to sit down," Sarah whispered, and without waiting for permission, she slid into the booth opposite him. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that after decades of dreaming about this reunion, it was happening in a restaurant where she was serving him dinner. All his wealth, all his power, all his carefully laid plans for finding her had been rendered meaningless by pure chance and a Tuesday night shift change. He studied her face again, memorizing every detail. She had her mother's delicate bone structure, but his stubborn chin, and the same intense focus he recognized from looking in the mirror. There were lines of fatigue around her eyes that spoke of struggles he hadn't been there to help her through, and the knowledge of his absence during her hardest moments cut deeper than any business loss he had ever suffered. "Why are you here?" Sarah asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "In this restaurant, I mean. Do you come here often?" "Every Tuesday for 3 years, Marcus admitted. I never thought I would find you like this." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. He had been searching, always searching, but never in the right places. While he had been hiring private investigators and checking adoption records in distant cities, she had been here all along, working in a restaurant 15 minutes from his office. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back with the practiced composure of someone who had learned early not to show vulnerability. "I have so many questions," she said. "I have answers," Marcus replied. "Or at least, I have my version of the truth." The weight of 27 years pressed down on both of them. There were explanations to be given, hurts to be acknowledged, and a relationship to be rebuilt from the ground up. But for now, in this moment, it was enough that they were breathing the same air, sharing the same space, no longer strangers but not yet father and daughter. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this impossible reunion that neither of them had dared to hope for. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that decades had carved. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the locket at her throat, a gesture so achingly familiar that Marcus felt his chest constrict. He had watched her do the same thing as a toddler, clutching at whatever small comfort she could find when the world felt too big and uncertain. "I remember fragments," Sarah said finally, her voice fragile as spun glass. "Dreams that felt too real to be dreams. A man with kind eyes who would read me stories about brave princesses. A voice singing lullabies in a room that smelled like cedar and aftershave." Marcus's throat tightened. The nursery he had built in his penthouse, with its hand-carved cedar furniture and walls painted to look like an enchanted forest. He had spent months planning every detail, imagining the bedtime stories they would share, the memories they would create. All of it had been dismantled within a week of the custody ruling, packed away like evidence of a crime he had never committed. "You had a stuffed elephant named Peanut," Marcus said softly. "You carried him everywhere. He was missing one ear because you liked to chew on it when you were thinking." A tear escaped down Sarah's cheek despite her efforts to contain it. "I still have him," she whispered. "He's in a box in my apartment. I could never throw him away, but I never understood why he mattered so much to me." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Through all the years of separation, through the lies and the legal barriers and the false death certificate, some part of their connection had endured. She had kept a piece of him without even knowing it was him she was keeping. "Your mother," Marcus began, then stopped. How could he explain the woman who had been both the love of his life and the architect of his deepest pain? "She was young when we met. Brilliant, beautiful, but trapped in a family that measured worth by social standing and political connections. When she got pregnant, her father saw it as a catastrophe that needed managing." Sarah's jaw tightened, and Marcus recognized his own stubborn streak in the gesture. "So you were the problem that needed to be eliminated. I was 28, running a small investment firm that was just starting to make real money. But I wasn't the right kind of wealthy. I didn't have the proper bloodline or the correct connections. Judge Harrison made it very clear that I was a mistake his daughter had made, one that could be corrected with enough pressure and the right legal maneuvers." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Marcus had spent years burying these emotions beneath layers of professional success and calculated indifference. But sitting across from his lost daughter, the wounds felt fresh and raw, as if they had been carved yesterday. "He told everyone you were dead," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "My mother, my stepfather, everyone. They said you died in a car accident before I was born. There was even a fake obituary." Marcus's hands clenched into fists on the table. The depth of the deception was staggering, even by the standards of a man who had witnessed countless corporate betrayals. They hadn't just taken his daughter, they had murdered his memory, erasing his existence so completely that she had grown up believing herself an orphan of a ghost. "I tried to fight," Marcus said, the words coming out harsh and desperate. "I spent everything I had on lawyers, private investigators, appeals. But your grandfather had been on the federal bench for 30 years. He knew every judge, every clerk, every prosecutor in 3 states. My legal team was like children playing with toy soldiers against a real army." "Why didn't you try to contact me when I got older?" The question carried no accusation, only a profound sadness that made Marcus's heart ache. "I did try. The adoption was sealed, your records classified. Every private investigator I hired ran into walls that had been built specifically to keep me out. When you turned 18, I had people watching every college in the state, hoping you might apply somewhere I could track." But Emma Chen had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Sarah absorbed this information with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Marcus could see her evaluating his words, testing them against her own fractured memories and the official story she had been fed for decades. "I changed my name back," she said quietly. when I turned 21. Not to Holloway, because I didn't know that was my real name, but I never felt like a Chen. I chose Sarah because it felt like mine in a way Emma never did. The simple statement carried the weight of a lifetime of identity confusion. Marcus realized that while he had been searching for Emma Chen, she had been trying to find herself as Sarah, both of them chasing shadows of a truth that had been deliberately obscured. "What about your mother?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Does she know you're here? That you're working?" Sarah's expression darkened, and for a moment she looked exactly like her grandfather, all sharp angles and barely contained fury. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer. David, my stepfather, remarried 6 months later. His new wife made it very clear that I was a reminder of an uncomfortable past she'd rather forget. I've been on my own since then." The revelation hit Marcus like a sledgehammer. While he had been building his empire and nursing his wounds, his daughter had been struggling alone, fighting battles he should have been there to help her face. The money he had spent on private investigators and legal fees could have paid for her education, given her the security and opportunities she deserved. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt criminally inadequate. "I should have found a way. I should have tried harder." "You couldn't have known," Sarah replied, but there was a distance in her voice that hadn't been there before. The initial shock of recognition was wearing off, replaced by the more complex emotions of anger, grief, and a deep sense of loss that couldn't be easily repaired. A server approached their table tentatively, clearly aware that something significant was happening but unsure whether to interrupt. Sarah looked up and seemed to remember where she was, what she was supposed to be doing. The spell of their reunion was broken by the mundane reality of her job, her responsibilities, the life she had built without him. "I have to get back to work," she said, starting to slide out of the booth. "My manager will notice if I'm gone too long." Panic flared in Marcus's chest. He had found her after 27 years, and now she was walking away again. The thought of losing her a second time was unbearable, but he could see the walls going up behind her eyes, the protective mechanisms she had developed to survive in a world that had never been particularly kind to her. "Wait," he said, reaching across the table without thinking. His fingers brushed hers, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. "Please don't disappear again. I know this is overwhelming. I know it changes everything, but I can't lose you twice." Sarah stared down at their joined hands, and Marcus could see her internal war playing out across her features. Part of her wanted to run, to escape back into the safer territory of not knowing, of maintaining the careful distance she had cultivated from painful truths. But another part, the part that had kept Peanut all these years and chosen a name that felt like her own, was desperate for connection. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to have a father. I've been alone for so long." "Neither do I," Marcus confessed. "I don't know how to be a father to a grown woman I've never really known. But I want to learn. I want to try, if you'll let me." The restaurant continued its quiet symphony around them, but Marcus felt as though they existed in a bubble outside of time and space. This moment would define everything that came next, would determine whether the next 27 years would be marked by connection or continued separation. Sarah pulled her hands away gently, but didn't stand up. "I finish my shift at 11, she said finally. "There's an all-night diner 3 blocks north of here, Mel's Place. If you want to talk more, really talk, meet me there." It was a tentative bridge, fragile and uncertain, but it was something. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. As Sarah stood and smoothed her uniform, he could see her gathering her professional composure like armour, preparing to face the rest of her shift with this monumental secret burning inside her chest. "Sarah," he called softly as she turned to go. She paused, looking back at him with eyes that held a lifetime of questions and the faintest glimmer of hope. "I never stopped looking for you," Marcus said. "Not for a single day." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Sarah nodded once, a gesture that could have meant anything or everything, then walked away to tend to her other tables, leaving Marcus alone with the wreckage of his carefully ordered world and the miraculous gift of a second chance he had never dared to believe he deserved. The next 2 hours passed like centuries for Marcus. He remained at table 17 long after his untouched salmon had grown cold, staring at his reflection in the Rain Street windows while his mind raced through scenarios he had rehearsed countless times but never expected to actually face. Every few minutes he would catch glimpses of Sarah moving between tables with practiced efficiency, her professional smile never quite reaching her eyes. I watched her interact with other customers, noting the way she tilted her head when taking orders, how she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating. These small gestures felt like archaeological discoveries, fragments of the person she had become during all the years he had missed. The toddler who had giggled at his silly voices had grown into this poised, resilient woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity that both broke his heart and filled him with fierce pride. At 10:30, Marcus paid his bill with hands that trembled slightly as he signed the check. He left a tip that was far more generous than usual, though he suspected Sarah might find it patronizing rather than helpful. Everything felt fraught with potential missteps, landmines buried in the simplest interactions. How did you rebuild a relationship that had been destroyed before it could properly begin? The walk to Mel's place took him through streets that felt transformed by the evening's revelations. The familiar cityscape seemed foreign now, as if he were seeing it through different eyes. Every storefront, every street lamp, every crack in the sidewalk existed in a world where his daughter was alive and working 3 blocks from his office. The knowledge rewrote his understanding of everything. Mel's place was exactly what its name suggested, a no-frills diner with cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting that buzzed like angry insects, and the perpetual smell of coffee and frying grease. It was the antithesis of the Golden Lily's refined atmosphere, and Marcus felt oddly comforted by its honest shabbiness. This was a place for real conversations, not the carefully choreographed business dinners that comprised most of his social interactions. He chose a corner booth and ordered coffee he didn't want from a waitress who looked like she had been working double shifts since the Carter administration. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. What if Sarah changed her mind? What if the magnitude of what had happened overwhelmed her and she decided it was safer to disappear into the anonymous crowds of the city? At 11:15, the bell above the door chimed and Sarah walked in. She had changed out of her work uniform into jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Her hair was loose now, falling in waves around her shoulders, and Marcus was struck by how much she resembled her mother at that age. The resemblance was both a gift and a knife in his chest. She slid into the booth across from him with the cautious movements of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. The waitress appeared instantly, pouring coffee without being asked, and Sarah wrapped her hands around the mug, as if drawing warmth from its ceramic surface. "I almost didn't come," she said without preamble. "I sat in my car for 10 minutes trying to decide if this was the stupidest thing I've ever done." "What changed your mind?" Marcus asked, afraid to hear the answer but needing to know. Sarah's fingers found the locket again. That nervous gesture that seemed to ground her when the world felt unstable. "I realized I'd been waiting my whole life for this conversation, even when I didn't know what I was waiting for. The dreams, the feeling that something was missing, the way I never felt like I belonged anywhere. Maybe I need to stop running from difficult truths." The honesty in her voice was devastating. Marcus could see the courage it took for her to sit here, to open herself up to the possibility of more pain after a lifetime of disappointments. She had every right to walk away, to protect herself from whatever complications he might bring into her carefully constructed independence. "Tell me about your life," Marcus said. "The real version, not the sanitized summary. I want to know who you are, what matters to you, what keeps you awake at night." Sarah's laugh was bitter, edged with exhaustion. "You sure you want the unfiltered truth? It's not a very inspiring story." "I've missed 27 years of your stories. I want all of them. inspiring or not. She studied his face as if trying to determine whether he could handle the weight of her reality. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she began to speak with the halting cadence of someone unaccustomed to being truly heard. After Mum died, I found out that the life insurance policy she'd always talked about didn't exist. David had cashed it out years earlier to cover some bad investments. The house went into foreclosure, and his new wife made it clear I had exactly 30 days to find somewhere else to live. I had $2,000 in savings and a liberal arts degree that turned out to be worth approximately nothing in the job market. Marcus felt his jaw clench, but he remained silent, sensing that any interruption would cause her to retreat back into protective silence. "I've been working 2 jobs for the past 3 years," Sarah continued. "The restaurant at night, and I clean office buildings in the morning. I live in a studio apartment that's about the size of your dining room, and I haven't been to a doctor in 2 years because I can't afford health insurance. I eat ramen noodles 4 nights a week and consider it a luxury when I can buy name-brand coffee." The casual recitation of hardships hit Marcus like physical blows. While he had been accumulating wealth and influence, building an empire that meant nothing without someone to share it with, his daughter had been struggling to survive in a world that offered no safety nets for young women with dead mothers and indifferent stepfathers. "I could have helped," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "If I had known, if I had found you sooner, I could have made sure you never had to live like that." "But you didn't know," Sarah replied, and there was no accusation in her tone, only a weary acceptance that made it worse. "And I survived. I'm not looking for pity or rescue. I've learned to take care of myself." "That's not pity," Marcus said firmly. "That's regret. That's a father's rage at a system that failed his child. You shouldn't have had to learn to survive alone. You should have been able to focus on discovering who you wanted to become, not just figuring out how to pay rent." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, and Marcus saw tears threaten before she blinked them away with practiced efficiency. "Do you know what the worst part was? Not the poverty or the loneliness, or even watching Mom waste away in a hospital bed she couldn't afford. It was the feeling that I was fundamentally broken somehow, that there was something wrong with me that made people leave." "There was never anything wrong with you," Marcus said with quiet intensity. "You were stolen from me. Every day you felt abandoned, every night you went to bed feeling unwanted. That was time stolen from both of us by people who thought they knew better than love itself." The words hung between them, raw and honest in a way that Marcus's usual corporate speak could never be. He had spent decades learning to communicate in euphemisms and strategic ambiguities, but this moment demanded nothing less than absolute truth. "I used to make up stories about you," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Different versions depending on my mood. Sometimes you were a soldier who died heroically in some foreign war. Sometimes you were a famous artist who had to give me up to protect me from your dangerous lifestyle. Once, when I was really angry at Mom for something, I convinced myself you were a prince from some exotic country who would come back for me when I turned 18. Marcus's throat constricted. While he had been hiring investigators and checking hospital records, she had been creating fairy tales to fill the void his absence had left. The parallel searches for each other, separated by resources and information, but united in longing, felt like a cosmic cruelty. "What was your favourite version?" he asked. "The one where you didn't know about me," Sarah said without hesitation. "Where you would have moved heaven and earth to find me if you'd only known I existed. It was the only scenario where I could believe that someone somewhere might actually want me." The confession shattered something inside Marcus's chest. She had intuited the truth without any evidence, had chosen to believe in a love she had never experienced rather than accept that she was simply unwanted. The faith that choice represented was both heartbreaking and miraculous. "That wasn't just your favourite story," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "That was the truth. I did move heaven and earth. I just wasn't powerful enough to move the people who stood between us. Sarah reached across the table then, her fingers finding his with the same tentative courage she had shown all evening. The contact was electric, a circuit completed after decades of interruption. For a moment neither of them spoke, both overwhelmed by the simple reality of connection. "I don't know how to trust this," Sarah said finally. "I don't know how to believe that this isn't just another version of the stories alone." "Then don't trust I used to tell myself to feel better about being it yet," Marcus replied. "Let me prove it to you. Let me show you that this is real, that I'm not going anywhere this time. I know I can't undo the past 27 years, but I can make sure the next 27 are different." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. But Marcus had never felt more present in any moment of his life. The merger deals and board meetings that had consumed his attention for decades suddenly seemed like elaborate distractions from this, the only conversation that had ever truly mattered. Sarah pulled her hands back, but gently, without the defensive withdrawal he had feared. "I need time to process this," she said. "This changes everything I thought I knew about my life, about myself. I can't just flip a switch and suddenly have a father." "Take all the time you need," Marcus said, though every instinct screamed at him to hold on to this moment, to never let her walk away again. "But please, let me give you my number. Let me know you're safe. I've spent 27 years not knowing if you were alive or dead. I can't go back to that uncertainty." Sarah nodded, pulling out a phone that looked like it had seen better days. As Marcus recited his personal number, the one only his closest business associates had access to, he realized he was essentially handing his daughter the power to disrupt his entire, carefully ordered existence. The thought didn't frighten him the way it should have. Instead, it filled him with a hope so fierce it was almost painful. "Will you answer if I call?" Sarah asked, and the vulnerability in the question broke his heart. "Day or night," Marcus promised. "Board meetings, conference calls, international negotiations. Nothing will ever be more important than hearing from you." As they prepared to leave the diner, Marcus was struck by how anticlimactic this moment felt compared to the reunion fantasies he had nurtured over the years. There were no dramatic declarations, no tearful embraces, no instant healing of decades-old wounds. Instead, there was just this. Two damaged people trying to figure out how to build something new from the ruins of what should have been. "But maybe," Marcus thought as he watched Sarah walk to her car, that was exactly what real love looked like. Not the fairy tale reunion he had imagined, but the slow, careful work of two people choosing to trust each other, despite every reason not to. The rain had stopped while they were inside, and the streets gleamed with reflected light, as if the world itself had been washed clean and made ready for whatever came next. Marcus drove through the empty streets in a daze, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The city looked different now, transformed by the knowledge that somewhere in its maze of buildings and shadows, his daughter was driving home to a studio apartment he had never seen, carrying secrets and struggles he was only beginning to understand. When he reached his penthouse, the silence felt oppressive in a way it never had before. The space that had once represented the pinnacle of his success now seemed like a mausoleum, filled with expensive objects that meant nothing without someone to share them with. He poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering landscape of his empire. His reflection stared back at him, and for the first time in years, Marcus truly looked at himself. The silver hair, the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders had begun to carry the weight of decades. He was 62 years old, and he had spent the last 27 years building walls around his heart so high that he had forgotten what it felt like to hope for something beyond the next quarterly report. The scotch burned his throat, but it couldn't warm the cold emptiness that had taken up residence in his chest. He had found her. After all these years of searching, of wondering, of grieving a daughter who was alive but lost to him, she had been serving coffee and clearing tables 15 minutes from his office. The cosmic irony of it was almost too much to bear. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop, and Marcus's heart leapt before he realized it was just his assistant with tomorrow's schedule confirmation. The disappointment was crushing, even though he knew it was unrealistic to expect Sarah to call so soon. She needed time to process, to decide whether she wanted him in her life, or if tonight had been enough closure for her to finally move on. But what if she decided he wasn't worth the risk? What if the comfort of her carefully constructed independence outweighed the messy complications of letting him in? Marcus had spent decades reading people, understanding their motivations and leveraging their desires to close deals. But his daughter was a mystery to him, shaped by experiences he hadn't shared and hardships he hadn't been there to help her face. He thought about the way she had touched that locket, the unconscious gesture that had unlocked memories he had buried so deep he had forgotten they existed. The stuffed elephant named Peanut, sitting in a box in her apartment, like a talisman from a childhood that had been stolen from both of them. How many other fragments of their lost connection were scattered through her life, waiting to be rediscovered? The scotch glass was empty, but Marcus made no move to refill it. Alcohol wouldn't solve the problem of how to rebuild a relationship that had never been allowed to properly begin. It wouldn't bridge the gap between the successful businessman he had become and the father he had always wanted to be. Most importantly, it wouldn't erase the years of struggle and loneliness that had shaped Sarah into someone who trusted survival over sentiment. His mind drifted to the practical concerns that his daughter was too proud to voice. The studio apartment that was probably overpriced and underheated. The 2 jobs that were slowly grinding her down. The medical care she couldn't afford, and the dreams she had probably given up on years ago. Marcus had the resources to solve all of those problems with a single phone call, but he also understood that offering help too quickly might feel like an attempt to buy her affection. Shay had said she didn't want rescue, and he believed her. But wanting and needing were different things entirely. There had to be a way to provide support without making her feel like charity case. Some method of helping that preserved her dignity while easing the burdens that no young woman should have to carry alone. The answer came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the horizon. Not rescue, but opportunity. Not charity, but investment in the person she was becoming, rather than compensation for the person she might have been. Marcus pulled out his phone and began making notes, his business mind finally finding a problem it could solve without causing more harm. By morning, he had the framework of a plan. Nothing dramatic or overwhelming, just a series of small gestures that might demonstrate his commitment without triggering her defensive instincts. A consulting job with his company that would utilize her liberal arts education. Health insurance as a standard employee benefit. A salary that would allow her to quit the second job and maybe even pursue interests beyond mere survival. But first he had to get through the longest day of his life waiting for her to call. Marcus arrived at his office earlier than usual, partly from insomnia and partly because work felt like the only thing that might distract him from the phone that remained stubbornly silent. His assistant Jennifer noticed immediately that something was different about him. After 8 years of managing his schedule, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read his moods. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, setting his coffee on the desk with characteristic efficiency. "Something like that," Marcus replied, staring at his phone as if he could will it to ring through sheer force of concentration. The morning crawled by with excruciating slowness. Marcus found himself checking his phone every few minutes, his attention fragmenting during meetings that would normally command his complete focus. His colleagues noticed the distraction but were too polite or too intimidated to comment directly. Only Robert Chen, his head of acquisitions, was bold enough to voice what everyone was thinking. "You seem off your game today, Marcus. Everything all right?" The question hung in the air during their lunch meeting, surrounded by the ambient noise of the private club where Marcus conducted most of his important business. The irony of Chen's question wasn't lost on him. Here was a man whose very surname connected him to the family that had stolen his daughter, expressing concern for his well-being with what appeared to be genuine care. "Family matters," Marcus said carefully, testing the words on his tongue. How long had it been since he'd had legitimate family matters to worry about? Chen nodded with understanding. Those can be the most challenging negotiations of all. Family dynamics rarely follow the same rules as business relationships. The observation was more perceptive than Chen probably realized. Marcus had spent so many years approaching every relationship as a transaction that he had forgotten how to navigate the messy, unpredictable territory of genuine human connection. With Sarah, there were no contracts to sign, no terms to negotiate, no clear metrics for success or failure. There was only the leap of faith that love might be enough to bridge the chasm of lost time. By 3 o'clock, Marcus had abandoned any pretense of productivity. He dismissed his afternoon appointments and found himself driving through the city with no particular destination, just the need to move, to do something other than sit in his office staring at a silent phone. Without conscious direction, he found himself parked across the street from the Golden Lily, watching the lunch crowd filter in and out of the restaurant where his world had changed the night before. The building looked different in daylight, more ordinary somehow. The magical quality that had transformed it into a theatre for impossible reunions had faded with the morning sun, leaving only brick and glass and the mundane reality of commerce. But somewhere inside that ordinary building, his daughter had spent years serving food to strangers, never knowing that her father was searching for her in all the wrong places. His phone finally rang at 4:17 in the afternoon. Marcus nearly dropped it in his haste to answer, his heart hammering against his ribs as Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hello," he said, trying to keep the desperate hope out of his voice. "Hi," Sarah replied, and he could hear traffic noise in the background, the sounds of a city that kept moving even when individual lives hung in the balance. "I've been thinking all day about last night, about what it means, what happens next." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Marcus asked, afraid to breathe too deeply lest he somehow jinx this fragile moment of connection. There was a long pause, filled with the ambient noise of Sarah's world. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a decision that had clearly cost her considerable internal struggle. "I want to try," she said simply. "I don't know how this works, and I'm scared of getting hurt again, but I think I need to know who you really are, who we might be together." The relief that flooded through Marcus was so intense it left him lightheaded. He had prepared himself for rejection, for the possibility that one night of revelation might be all they would ever have. But she was choosing to take the risk, to step into the unknown territory of relationship despite every reason to protect herself. "What would that look like?" Marcus asked. "How do we begin something that should have started 27 years ago?" "Slowly," Sarah said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Maybe dinner somewhere that isn't my workplace. Maybe you could tell me about the man who bought that locket, about who you were before everything went wrong." "I'd like that more than you know," Marcus said. "When?" "Tomorrow night. There's a little Italian place near my apartment. Nothing fancy, but the food is honest and the wine doesn't cost more than my rent." Marcus smiled at the gentle teasing in her tone. Already she was teaching him that the world beyond his insulated bubble of wealth had its own measures of value, its own definitions of quality that had nothing to do with price tags or prestige. "Text me the address," he said. "I'll be there." "Marcus," Sarah said, using his first name for the first time, and the sound of it in her voice was like a gift he hadn't known he needed. "Thank you for not giving up, for never stopping the search. Thank you for being brave enough to let me find you," he replied. After they hung up, Marcus sat in his car for another 20 minutes, watching the ordinary street scene play out before him with extraordinary eyes. People walked past carrying their own hidden stories, their own secret losses and unexpected discoveries. Somewhere in the city, his daughter was finishing her workday and preparing to take another leap of faith. Tomorrow night they would share a meal and begin the delicate work of learning to trust each other. The sun was setting behind the buildings, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that Marcus hadn't noticed in years. For the first time since his divorce, the future felt like something worth anticipating, rather than something to be endured. He had found his daughter, and against all odds she was willing to let him try to be her father. It wasn't the fairy tale reunion he had imagined during the darkest nights of the past 27 years. It was something better. It was real, complicated, fragile, and full of the kind of hope that could only exist between two people who had learned that love was worth the risk of heartbreak. As Marcus finally drove home, he realized that everything he had built during his daughter's absence had been preparation for this moment. The success, the wealth, the influence, all of it had been meaningless without someone to share it with. But now, finally, he had the chance to discover what kind of man he might become when love was his primary motivation instead of an afterthought. The penthouse felt different when he walked through the door that evening. Still quiet, but no longer empty. Tomorrow night would mark the beginning of whatever came next. And for the first time in decades, Marcus Holloway was genuinely excited to find out what that might be. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of Sarah's new apartment, watching her arrange books on shelves that he had helped her pick out the weekend before. The space was modest, but filled with light. A dramatic improvement from the studio she had been forced to call home for so long. She had accepted his offer of employment at Holloway Industries, not in some manufactured position designed to ease his guilt, but as a genuine contributor to the company's new community outreach initiative. The transition hadn't been seamless. There had been awkward dinners where conversation felt forced, moments when the weight of lost years pressed down on both of them like a physical presence. Sarah had struggled with accepting help, viewing every gesture of support through the lens of someone who had learned that kindness often came with hidden costs. Marcus had grappled with the urge to solve all her problems immediately, slowly learning that being a father meant respecting her autonomy even when his instincts screamed at him to shield her from every difficulty. But gradually they had found their rhythm. Weekly dinners became twice-weekly coffee meetings, became text messages throughout the day about nothing and everything. Sarah had introduced him to her world of honest diners and second-hand bookstores, while Marcus had shown her the parts of his success that actually mattered. The charitable foundations and scholarship programs that had grown from his need to find meaning beyond profit margins. The stuffed elephant named Peanut now sat on her bookshelf, no longer hidden away in a box, but displayed with the dignity of a cherished memory finally acknowledged. Next to it was a framed photo from their first real vacation together, a week in the mountains where they had talked until sunrise and discovered that they shared the same stubborn streak and the same dry sense of humour. "You know," Sarah said, not looking up from her unpacking, "I used to dream about having a father who would show up to help me move. I just never imagined it would happen when I was 28 and he would insist on hiring professional movers because he was afraid I'd hurt my back lifting boxes." Marcus laughed, the sound easier now than it had been in decades. "I have a lot of catching up to do. 27 years of overprotective parenting compressed into however much time you'll give me." "That's a lifetime sentence," Sarah warned, but her smile softened the words. "You sure you're ready for that kind of commitment?" Looking at his daughter, this remarkable woman who had survived everything the world had thrown at her and still chose to trust in the possibility of connection, Marcus felt the last piece of his carefully guarded heart finally surrender. The empire he had built meant nothing compared to this ordinary moment in a sun-filled apartment, watching someone he loved create a home. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," he said, and meant it completely. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest moments. A chance encounter in a restaurant, a voice that sounds familiar, a locket that carries the weight of decades. Marcus and Sarah's story reminds us that love doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and fireworks. Sometimes it whispers in the space between strangers, waiting patiently for the moment when hearts are finally ready to recognize what they've been searching for all along. The families we lose and the families we find are equally precious, equally capable of healing wounds we thought were permanent. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they turn out to be the same family, just waiting for the right moment to come home.